On a February morning in 1952, in a garden high in the Kenyan hills, a young man walked his wife slowly across the wet grass and told her that her father was dead and that she was now the Queen. A few steps away stood a woman of 22 who had known that young man since they were children. And in the next moment, she did something no one had ever done to Elizabeth before. She gave her a hug. Then she sank into a deep curtsy. Lady Pamela Mountbatten had grown up beside Prince Philip in the same scattered, stateless royal family, and for 70 years she would watch him more closely than almost anyone alive. She knew the man the world laughed at. She also knew the boy underneath. What she saw, she kept. If you love the stories that happen just outside the frame of the famous photograph, subscribe and stay close, because this is one of them, told by the woman who was standing there. Chapter 1. A girl born into a vanishing world. She was born in Barcelona in the spring of 1929 into a family of kings without kingdoms and princes without countries. The name on the certificate was Pamela Carmen Louise Mountbatten, and almost every word of it carried a history of thrones that had already begun to fall. Her father was Lord Louis Mountbatten, a naval officer with the bearing of a man who expected to be looked at, and a bloodline that ran straight back through the royal houses of Germany and Russia and Greece. Her mother was Edwina Ashley, one of the greatest heiresses in England, the granddaughter of a financier named Sir Ernest Cassell, who had banked for a king and left her a fortune counted among the largest in the country. Pamela arrived as the second of their two daughters, into a world of nurseries and titles and long, shining corridors, at the exact moment that world was quietly ceasing to exist. To feel where she stood, you have to look at the web of blood around her, because it is the reason she would spend her life inside rooms other people only read about. She was a great-great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, the old sovereign whose descendants had been fitted onto half the thrones of Europe like keys into locks. She was a third cousin of the shy little girl in London who would one day be Queen Elizabeth. She was a great niece of the last Empress of Russia, the Tsarina who had been murdered with her husband and her children a little over a decade before Pamela was born. And, through her father's own sister, she was a first cousin of a boy called Philip, a prince of Greece and Denmark who had even less of a country than she did. These were not distant connections spoken of once a year at Christmas. These were the people at the table, the faces in the family photographs, the relations who came to stay. Her father had been born a prince himself, Prince Louis of Battenberg, in the German royal fashion, into a family that had served the British crown for a generation and thought of itself as thoroughly at home in England. Then came the Great War, and with it a wave of feeling against everything German so fierce that a foreign-sounding name became a danger rather than a distinction. A Prince of Battenberg in the Royal Navy had quietly become a liability to be managed. So the family did the thing that would define its whole character in the century to come. It gave up the German name and the German titles, took the plain English name Mountbatten in their place, and set about becoming more British than the British themselves. It was a lesson Pamela absorbed long before she could have put it into words. A family could lose its country, its title, even its name, and survive on nerve and proximity and the memory of what it had been. The continent she was born into was littered with such families, royalty washed up on foreign shores by the wars and revolutions of the century, living in rented houses on the kindness of grander cousins, holding on to their titles and their memories and almost nothing else. Her grandmother, a woman who had seen the whole catastrophe up close, had a phrase for the poorer and sadder of these exiles who drifted through the drawing rooms of Europe with their fallen dignity intact and little else. She called them the princesses of nothing. It was said with pity and with a certain steel. because the grandmother understood exactly how thin the line was between the families that still had thrones and the families that only had memories, and she had watched more than one cousin cross it. Consider the arithmetic of that inheritance, because the numbers tell you why the loneliness of grandeur could hide so well. By the time Pamela was a small child, at least 4 of the thrones her family was tied to by blood had already fallen or were about to. The Russian throne was gone, drowned in revolution and murder. The Greek throne, her cousin Philip's, had thrown his family out into exile when he was barely a year old. The German principalities her father's people had come from had been swept away entirely in the wreck of 1918, and the Spanish throne would collapse within 2 years of her birth, sending yet another crowned relation into the wandering life of the dispossessed. She was born, in the plainest terms, at the funeral of a whole class of people, and she was born very near the front of the procession. Her christening said everything about the height and the strangeness of her position, and it is worth setting down in full. She was baptized in the summer of 1929 at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, in the very heart of royal London, and her godparents were not friends of the family in any ordinary sense of the word. One of them was the King of Spain, Alfonso XIII, a reigning monarch who would himself be driven from his throne and into permanent exile within 2 years of holding this baby at the font. Another was the Duke of Kent, a son of the British king. A child, a few weeks old, had been placed, quite deliberately, in the arms of Europe's crowned and soon-to-be uncrowned heads, and marked from the start as one of their own. It was a christening that doubled as a statement of belonging, an insistence that whatever else fell, this family would stay inside the circle. What saved the Mountbattens, and what would shape the whole of Pamela's life, is that her branch of that dying aristocracy had done 2 things the fallen cousins had not. It had gone to sea, and it had married money. Her father built a career in the Royal Navy that would carry him, in time, to the very summit of it, an anchor of real achievement in a world of inherited air. Her mother's fortune, banked and landed and enormous, gave the family a hardness of ground beneath its feet that the exiled relations simply did not possess. So Pamela grew up not as a princess of nothing, but as the daughter of a house that had money, a great career, and a place at every important table, while remaining close enough to the fallen to understand, in her bones, exactly how far there was to drop. She was raised, in effect, on the safe side of a cliff edge, and she never once forgot that the drop was there. And into that fortunate household, again and again, through the whole of her childhood, came the boy from the poorest branch of all. Her cousin Philip had the grand name and the royal blood and none of the safety. His family had been expelled from Greece, his relations scattered across the continent in borrowed rooms, and it was to the Mountbattens, to Pamela's own people, that he was sent for the things a child needs and could not otherwise find: a home for the school holidays, a grown man who took a steady interest in him, somewhere, anywhere, to belong. Pamela watched him arrive and watched him leave all through the 1930s, this cousin who was a prince and had nowhere of his own to go, and though she could not have known it, she was watching the boy who would one day marry the future of England. She only knew then that he was family, that he was quick and sharp and guarded, and that in the truest sense he was himself one of the princesses of nothing, a royal child with no ground under his feet. Her own father had quietly decided to be the ground. It is the shape of the whole story, set down here at the start. On one side, a girl with every advantage the century could offer, born to watch. On the other, a boy with the same royal blood and none of the safety, born to be watched. For 70 years they would move through the same rooms, and she would keep her eyes on him, and she would come to understand, better than the crowds who cheered or the newspapers that laughed, exactly what it had cost him to arrive at last somewhere he could call home. Chapter 2. The Mother Who Was Never There. The two Mountbatten daughters were raised by nannies, by staff, and by a menagerie, while their mother crossed the world in search of something she could not name. It is one of the quiet cruelties of great wealth that it can give a child everything except the two people it most wants, and Pamela grew up rich in every way but that one. Her sister Patricia was the elder, the steadier, the heir to the title and the temperament to carry it. Pamela was the younger, the sharper, the watchful one, the child who noticed. And what she noticed first, and never stopped noticing, was how often the great house was full of everything except her parents. Her mother, Edwina, was a phenomenon of the age, beautiful, restless, and almost frightening in her modernity. She had come into one of the largest fortunes in Britain while still a young woman, the whole of old Sir Ernest Cassell's banking wealth landing in her lap, and she spent her early married years in a blur of perpetual motion, travelling the globe, chasing sensation across continents, sometimes vanishing from her daughters' lives for weeks on end. In Pamela's own later account, written with a striking absence of bitterness, her mother was a traveller and a thrill-seeker who might be gone before the girls woke and back long after they slept. A comet that passed through the nursery rather than a fixed star hung steadily above it. Her father, meanwhile, belonged to the Navy, and the Navy took him where it pleased, so that the pageant of a Mountbatten childhood was often a pageant watched from an upstairs window with the staff standing quietly behind. In the place of parents came a world that would sound like pure invention if it were not so carefully recorded. There was the great country house, Broadlands, in Hampshire, wide and green and grand, with its lawns running down to the river. There was the house in London. There were the animals, which mattered more to a lonely, clever girl than any of the grandeur ever could. Pamela's great love was a short-haired dachshund named Lottie, whom she called, without a trace of exaggeration, the very centre of her life. And there was the famous day her mother came home from a journey through southern Africa, in the way that rich and absent parents sometimes do, bearing not affection, but a spectacle. She had brought back a lion cub. It was called Sabi, and for a while a real lion grew up alongside the Mountbatten girls, a fact set down in Pamela's memoirs, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, which, in that house, it very nearly was. Look for a moment at the scale of the life, because the sheer size of it is what let the loneliness hide so completely. This was a family with a great estate in Hampshire and a house in London besides, with a staff running into the dozens, with a fortune counted among the very largest in the land, and with a social circle drawn from the crowned heads of an entire continent. When Edward VIII came to call, he arrived with his companion Wallis Simpson and brought, as a house gift, a boiled chicken carried down from a famous London shop. That was the register of the world Pamela moved through as a child, where the guests might be fallen kings, where a lion might be in the garden, and where a mother was, as often as not, somewhere on the far side of the horizon. The grandeur was total, and the two little girls at the middle of it were, in the way that matters most, frequently alone. Set the fortune itself against the century, because the sheer scale of it is part of the reason the two girls could be so completely surrounded and so genuinely alone at the very same time. The money had come down to Edwina from her grandfather, Sir Ernest Cassell, one of the richest financiers in the England of his day, and when the old man died, the bulk of that vast fortune passed to his granddaughter. It was counted among the very largest private fortunes in the whole country. It bought Broadlands and the London house and the staff by the dozen, the nurseries and the governesses and the motor cars. The entire soft machine of a great household that ran along so smoothly that a mother could vanish from the middle of it for weeks on end, and the wheels would still turn without a squeak. That was the paradox at the centre of Pamela's childhood, laid out plainly in pounds and in acres. There was money enough to buy every comfort a child could think to name, and money enough, at the same time, to hire other people to provide the one single thing that money cannot ever actually buy, which is a parent's steady, ordinary, daily presence. The staff were kind. The houses were beautiful beyond description, and the two small girls learned, very early, to find their warmth where they could, in a dachshund and a lion cub, and above all in each other. Then the war came, and it scattered even that. When the fighting began in 1939, the two girls were sent for safety across the Atlantic to the United States, away from the bombs that everyone in England expected to fall. Pamela spent part of those years among the American rich, staying with the Vanderbilt family at their address on Fifth Avenue in New York. A world of a different kind of money, newer and louder and more confident than her own. But she was homesick in the particular way that only a displaced child can be, aching for the country and the family that had sent her away out of love. And by the winter of 1941, she had come home to England, back into the war, because being frightened at home felt better than being safe among strangers. It was a small, early rehearsal for the theme of her whole life, the pull toward the people she belonged to, whatever the danger of being near them. Home meant boarding school in Dorset, and here the fairy tale thins out into cold and rationed reality. The country was at war, and the shortages bit hard even into privileged lives. Pamela remembered the water freezing in the glasses on the bedside tables overnight, the kind of small, hard detail a person keeps only because they lived it and could not forget it. She remembered running errands around the village at the age of 13 with a black and white pony and an old dog cart, a small figure doing small, useful things while the world burned at the edges of the map. The heiress's daughter was learning, early and for good, that comfort could be taken away, that a family could be sent across an ocean at a day's notice, that the whole grand life was held up by nothing more solid than luck and the absence of bombs. It was a knowledge that never left her, and it gave her, for the rest of her days, a certain steadiness in the face of loss that people often mistook for coldness, and that was really only experience. All of this built the woman she became, and it built, above everything else, her particular and useful gift. A child who is often left to watch becomes very good at watching. A child raised among adults who come and go learns to read a room, to sense a mood before it is spoken, to notice who is unhappy behind a smile, and to say nothing at all about it. Pamela grew up fluent in the manners and the silences of a vanishing Europe, at ease in several languages and a dozen great houses, and permanently, valuably, on the edge of the frame. She was always in the room, and never in the picture. It was a place she had been put as a girl, by absence and by circumstance, and it was a place she would go on to occupy by choice and by real talent, for the whole length of a very long life. And it was into this same house, with its absent mother and its watchful younger daughter, that her cousin Philip kept on coming. He was another child the grown-ups had forgotten to place at the centre of anything, another one raised at the edges of other people's lives, shuttled between the houses of relations. Whatever else divided the girl with the fortune from the boy with only the blood, they shared this one thing from the very beginning, and it bound them more truly than the cousinhood on paper ever could. They both knew from the inside exactly what it was to be a child in a grand house that belonged, in the end, to somebody else. Chapter 3. The Boy from Nowhere. Her cousin Philip had a name, a title, and no home on earth that was truly his. This is the fact the cheering crowds of his later life never quite grasped, and the fact that Pamela understood in her bones because she had watched it up close from the nursery onward. The man who would stand beside the Queen of England for 70 years began as the most rootless child in a family of rootless children, and almost everything the public would later find strange about him, the brusqueness, the armour, the flat refusal ever to be pitied, grew directly out of a beginning that would have broken a softer boy entirely. He was born a prince of Greece and Denmark on the 10th of June in 1921, on the dining room table of a house called Mont Repos on the island of Corfu, in the last thin light of a Greek monarchy that was about to throw his whole family out. He was the 5th child and the only son, with 4 elder sisters already ahead of him, and he was little more than a year old when the catastrophe came. Greece lost a disastrous war, and in the reckoning that followed his uncle, King Constantine, was forced to abdicate, and his own father, Prince Andrew, was arrested and put on trial by a revolutionary court and banished from the country for the rest of his life. The family fled for their lives. And here is the detail that Pamela's world knew well, and that tells you everything about the beginning of the man. A British warship, HMS Calypso, was sent to lift the family out, and the infant Philip was carried down to safety in a cot fashioned from a fruit box, a prince evacuated from his homeland in a wooden crate. He never had a country of his own again. From that day he was a royal child of nowhere, a boy with a claim to a foreign throne, and not 1 square foot of ground he could stand on and call his. What followed was an exile dressed up as a childhood. The family came to rest for a time in France, on the edge of Paris, living in borrowed comfort on the kindness of grander and richer relations. And then the family itself came quietly apart. His 4 elder sisters, Margarita and Theodora and Cecilia and Sophie, grew up and married German princes, one after another, and vanished into Germany and into lives of their own that a much younger brother was too small and too poor to share. His father drifted away to the south of France, to Monte Carlo, to a life of cards and companionship and warm weather that had very little room in it for a young son. And his mother, Princess Alice, the gentlest and most tragic figure in the whole of this story, began to disappear in a different and more frightening way. She had been born profoundly deaf and had taught herself, by sheer force of will, to read lips in several languages, a feat that tells you exactly what kind of woman she was. But in these years she suffered a severe breakdown, an illness that would later be named as schizophrenia, and she was taken away to a sanatorium in Switzerland, removed from her children for years at a stretch. So a young boy found himself, in the space of a very short time, with his sisters gone into Germany, his father gone to the Riviera, and his mother gone into an illness that placed her wholly beyond his reach. Count what he had lost by the age when most children are learning their multiplication tables, because the list is the key to the man. A throne before he could walk, a country in a fruit box aboard a foreign warship, a father to the card tables of Monte Carlo, a mother to a Swiss sanatorium, 4 sisters to Germany and to marriages he was too young and too poor to be part of. He was a prince with no kingdom, no parents in any daily sense, no home, and almost no money, shuttled between the houses of relations who had troubles enough of their own. It reads like the setup of a tragedy, and the remarkable thing, the thing Pamela always insisted upon to the very end, is that it did not produce a broken man. It produced a hard one and a proud one. And above all, a man who had decided very young that he would never, under any circumstances, let another living soul see that he needed anything at all. His schooling matched the philosophy that a boy in his position seemed fated to absorb. He was moved from school to school across the countries of his scattered family, from a school in Paris to one in England to one in Germany, and at last, at the age of 14, to the place that would mark him for life, an austere school in the north of Scotland called Gordonstown. It was a school built on a hard creed, on cold and discipline, and the settled belief that hardship is the maker of character, that a boy is forged by being tested to his limits and beyond. For most children, it was a shock. For a boy who had already lost a throne, a country, and a family, it must have felt less like an education than a confirmation of everything he already knew, that the world was cold, that softness was a danger, and that the only safety lay in needing no one. He took to it. He excelled at it. He became precisely the sort of tough, capable, self-reliant young man the school existed to produce, and he carried that toughness for the rest of his days like a suit of armor he had learned never to take off. And the family that took him in, more consistently and more warmly than any other, was hers. It was the British Mountbattens, Pamela's own people, who became the fixed point in Philip's turning world. Her father, Lord Louis, the uncle with the naval career and the sharp eye for a young man of promise, effectively took on the boy's future as a personal project. He guided the schooling. He steered Philip toward the Royal Navy, the one institution on earth that could give a stateless prince a rank, a wage, a uniform, and a country to serve. And Philip took to the Navy as though he had been made for it, winning a genuinely fine war record mentioned in dispatches, a real officer by his own real effort. And in the holidays, again and again, Philip came to Broadlands, to the Mountbatten house, into the very rooms where Pamela was growing up watching. So she knew him not as a duke and not as a legend, but simply as the cousin who turned up, the older boy in the house, charming and quick and guarded, funny in a sharp and testing way, physically fearless, and armoured against sympathy in a manner that a watchful younger girl could not help but notice and remember. She saw, in other words, the version of him that existed before the fame, before the marriage, before the 7 decades of standing a careful pace behind. She saw the raw material of the man, and in that raw material she could already read the future, because the very qualities the British public would one day find so difficult, the impatience, the bluntness, the refusal of soft feeling, were plainly and legibly the scar tissue of a boy who had been given no reason on this earth to trust that showing a need would be met with anything but another loss. There is a cruelty in the shape of what came next, and it is worth seeing clearly here at the start, because the whole story turns upon it. This boy, with no country, no home, and no name of his own, was about to be offered all three, in a single stroke, by the most powerful family in the land. He would marry the heir to the British throne. He would be given a country at last, and the grandest one imaginable. He would be given a home, several of them, palaces even. And in exchange, quietly, he would be asked to surrender the one thing he had built entirely for himself out of the wreckage of his childhood, his naval career, his hard-won independence, in time even his own family name, and to spend the rest of his life walking a single pace behind his wife, useful and titled and permanently, unalterably, in second place. The boy from nowhere was about to arrive somewhere at last. The price of the ticket would be the very freedom he had fought so hard to find, and Pamela Mountbatten would have a closer view than almost anyone alive of what that bargain did to him, year after year, for the rest of both their lives. Chapter 4. The Girl at the Edge of History. At 18, she walked the corridors of a palace so vast it took 10 minutes to reach the dining room, and she learned to stand at the centre of enormous events and say nothing. The place was the Viceroy's house in New Delhi, and the year was 1947, and Pamela Mountbatten had arrived, in the long shadow of her father, at one of the true hinges of the whole 20th century. Britain was giving up India, the largest and richest possession of the greatest empire the world had ever assembled, and the man sent out to lower the flag and hand over power was her own father. She went with him, and in going, she stopped being merely a girl of grand connections and became something a great deal rarer, a young woman physically present in the room where history itself was being decided. The scale of the world she stepped into is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. The Viceroy's house was not a house in any ordinary meaning of the word. It was a palace on a scale to rival any royal seat in Europe, set in formal gardens that seemed to run clean to the horizon. Pamela recorded, with the flat precision of a person who found the whole thing faintly absurd, that it could take a full 10 minutes simply to walk from her bedroom to the dining room. She recorded that the household kept some 25 gardeners employed for nothing but the arrangement of the flowers. There were staff beyond counting, uniformed and silent and everywhere. A vast machine of empire built to overwhelm the eye and impress the subject. And a girl of 18 was set down in the very middle of it as the daughter of the last viceroy, in the final months before the whole immense apparatus was handed over to other hands forever. But she did not merely decorate the vice-regal round, and this is the true making of her. She worked. In the frantic, sleepless months of the handover, as an entire subcontinent was carved into 2 new countries against a timetable measured in weeks rather than years, Pamela served as an informal aide and a co-secretary to her father, inside the very offices where the maps were being drawn and the future of hundreds of millions of people was being weighed and settled. She was trusted with papers, with errands, with confidences, at an age when most girls of her class were being taught how to seat a dinner table. And she gave her hands as well to the human cost of it all, helping in an overstretched clinic and dispensary, and lending herself to the canteens, because the birth of the 2 new nations came soaked in blood, and there was work of that kind everywhere a person cared to look. For that is the other and darker truth of India in 1947, and the story must not look away from it in order to keep the palace pretty. The division of the country, the drawing of the line that split it into India and Pakistan, unleashed one of the largest and most terrible movements of human beings in all of recorded history. Perhaps 15 million people were uprooted, torn from homes their families had held for centuries, and set walking in opposite directions across a new and invisible border. Perhaps 1 million or more of them died in the violence that came with it, in trains that arrived at their platforms full of the dead, in villages emptied overnight by massacre, in a communal fury that no one in authority proved able to contain. Pamela's father stood at the very centre of it and would be argued over ever after, praised by some for holding the ceremony of transfer together, and blamed by others for the reckless haste of the timetable that helped to spill the blood. And Pamela was there, at 18, inside the residence at the eye of the storm, close enough to the decisions to understand them and young enough to carry the images of what they cost for the rest of her natural life. The numbers of that division still have the power to stop the breath, and they belong in any honest telling of what the 18-year-old girl was standing beside. Something on the order of 15 million people were driven from their homes in the space of a few short weeks, the largest movement of human beings in all of recorded history. Whole populations set walking in opposite directions across a border that had not so much as existed the month before. Perhaps 1 million of them, and by some counts a great many more, did not survive the journey at all, killed in the massacres and the reprisals and the sheer murderous chaos of the thing. Trains crossed the new frontier carrying nothing but the dead. Columns of terrified people passed one another going opposite ways along the very same roads, and at the exact centre of the decision that lit it, in the study just down the long marble corridor, sat Pamela's own father, the man who had fixed the timetable and lowered the flag. She did not have the luxury of a simple opinion about any of it. She loved the man in the study with her whole heart. She had also seen, with her own eyes, the human cost of his work gathering at the dispensary door. And she learned, at 18 years old, the very hardest lesson that closeness to power ever teaches anyone, that the people who make history and the people who are crushed beneath it are sometimes only a single corridor apart, and that a person can love one of them and grieve for the others at the very same moment, and must, if she is to survive it, say almost nothing at all about either. There is a smaller creature in this chapter that Pamela herself always brought forward when she told the story, and it deserves to be kept because it shows the living girl inside the watchful witness. Her closest companion in that vast and solemn house was not a diplomat or a prince or a general, but a mongoose, a small wild thing named Neola that she had made a pet of, which followed her through the marble corridors and which, on at least one memorable occasion, treated the important papers on the Viceroy's own desk as a convenient place to relieve itself. She told the story with obvious delight for the rest of her life. It is the detail of a person who could stand in the very middle of an empire's ending and still see the comedy at the edges of it, who kept her humour and her humanity intact in the grandest and the gravest rooms she would ever enter. That steadiness, that refusal to be overwhelmed, was precisely what would qualify her for everything that came next, because India taught her the trade she would practice for the rest of her days. She learned to be present at the summit of great events and to remain, herself, entirely invisible. She learned to hold what she saw and to choose, with care, exactly what she said. She learned that the people at the very centre, her father alone in his study, the leaders of the new nations coming and going with the fate of millions in their hands, needed around them a few figures who could be trusted absolutely to see everything and repeat nothing. When the transfer of power was at last complete and India stood free, she carried that discretion straight across the Great Divide, going on to work for a time as a secretary to the first man the new nation sent to London as its High Commissioner, serving the country her father had just handed over. She had proved herself, and proved herself young, as the rarest and most valuable kind of insider, the one who can be relied upon completely in any room, at any moment, with anything. By the end of it, she was barely into her 20s, and she had already stood beside the fall of an empire. She had learned the palace and the dispensary, the flower gardens and the refugee columns, the ceremony of a handover and the massacres it could not prevent. She had learned that grandeur and catastrophe can live in the very same building, 10 minutes' walk apart. And she had learned, above all, to watch and to keep faith. She was ready now, though she could not possibly have known it, for a smaller room and a colder morning, for a treehouse in an African forest, and a garden where a young man she had known all her life would walk his wife slowly across the grass and change both their lives forever. She was always in the room, and never in the picture. India had made certain of it. Kenya, before very long, would prove it beyond any doubt. Chapter 5. Her Mother and the Uncontrollable Force. The greatest secret Pamela ever kept had nothing to do with a prince. It belonged to her own mother, and to the man who led a new nation. It sat at the very centre of her family. It was whispered about across 2 continents for the rest of the century, and she guarded it with a precision that tells you everything about the kind of witness she had trained herself to become. Long before she was ever asked to hold the private truth of Prince Philip, she had learned to hold the private truth of Edwina Mountbatten, and the lesson had come to her in the marble corridors of India, in the very months her father was ending an empire. Her mother was, by any measure, an extraordinary woman, and by the standards of her time, a scandalous one. Edwina had spent her 20s as a byword for reckless glamour, a rich man's granddaughter with too much money and too little to fill her days, and her marriage to Lord Louis had long since settled into an arrangement that both of them understood completely, and neither of them troubled to hide from their daughters. It was an open marriage in all but name, a private treaty in which each partner took companions and each allowed the other exactly the same freedom. Edwina had a long and settled attachment to a man the family knew as Bunny Phillips. Her husband had his own devoted companion in a woman named Yola Letellier. And the truly striking thing, the thing Pamela recorded without so much as a flicker of embarrassment, is that these were not hidden lovers skulking at the edges of the household. They became friends of the family, folded into the life of the house, present at the dinner table. The two Mountbatten girls grew up simply understanding that love and marriage were separate territories in their parents' world, and that a person of any discretion did not remark upon the border between them. But India brought Edwina a relationship of a wholly different order, and it is the one that history has never once stopped talking about. In the last convulsive months of British rule, Edwina Mountbatten and Jawaharlal Nehru, the brilliant, elegant, long-imprisoned nationalist who was about to become the first leader of a free India, formed a bond of extraordinary depth. He was one of the most compelling men of the entire age, she one of the most restless and searching women, and thrown together at the hinge of history, the two of them recognized in each other something that each had been looking for without ever quite finding it. Nehru himself, groping years afterward for words large enough to hold it, described the pull between them as the uncontrollable force. It was, on every serious account, including her own daughters, one of the great loves of both their lives, and it ran on in letters and in longing for years after they had parted. And here is where Pamela's testimony matters most, because she spent decades drawing a single line with the care of a surgeon, and the story must draw it in exactly the place she did. Her mother and Nehru, she wrote, were deeply in love. She never once denied the feeling, never diminished it, never pretended that the letters and the closeness and the ache of it were anything less than what they plainly were. But the relationship, she insisted, remained platonic. What Edwina found in Nehru, in her daughter's careful account, was the very thing her whole racing, dissatisfied life had been searching for, the companionship and the equality of spirit and intellect that she craved and had never found in a marriage of convenience, rather than a romance of the flesh. Two remarkable minds had met at the summit of enormous events and given each other something a good deal rarer than an affair. That was the distinction Pamela held to for the rest of her life, and it must be reproduced exactly as she made it, deeply in love, and yet not lovers in the body, because the moment it is flattened into a simple affair, it stops being the truth she actually told, and becomes the cheap gossip she spent decades refusing. There is a single image from those days that captures the strange, open warmth of it, and Pamela kept it fondly all her life. On the very day that India became free, in the vast, joyful crush of the celebrating crowds, Nehru at one point took hold of the young Pamela herself and passed her bodily across a sea of seated well-wishers, handing her over hundreds of human laps while everyone around them laughed. It is the memory of a family friend, an intimate, a man entirely woven into the fabric of her household, and it tells you that whatever this thing was between Nehru and her mother, it was lived in the open, among people who loved one another, without shame and without hiding. The leering certainty of a hidden affair that would later swirl around it missed the actual texture of it entirely, and Pamela knew that better than anyone alive. Set beside all of it, the woman herself was far more than the sum of her attachments, and Pamela was careful, always, to record that too. Edwina had turned her restless energy, in her later years, into ferocious public work. She gave herself to the Red Cross and to the St. John Ambulance Brigade, with a seriousness that astonished those who had known her only as a socialite of the gossip columns, driving herself across war zones and famine districts and the wreckage of a collapsing empire until her health began at last to give way beneath the strain. She was a difficult, dazzling, largely absent mother and a genuinely great humanitarian, both of those things at the very same time, and her younger daughter managed the rare and generous feat of seeing her with total clarity and loving her without reservation anyway. There was a cost to Edwina in all of it that Pamela alone truly measured. The love that could not be lived openly was carried instead in letters, a great many of them, passing back and forth between England and India across the years that were left to her mother. A correspondence of two minds conducted at a distance of whole continents. It was the shape of an enormous feeling forced to survive on paper, and Pamela, who had grown up watching her mother's endless restlessness, understood that this late and unlikely attachment had at last given Edwina something that all the motion and all the money in the world never had. And she understood, too, that the whole of it depended entirely on silence, on the willingness of the very few people who knew to hold the knowledge and never once trade it away. She watched grown adults, some of them the most powerful people in two countries, place their private dignity completely into the hands of those around them, and she learned the enormous, unpurchasable value of a person who could be trusted with such a thing absolutely and forever. It was a currency far more precious than any that her grandfather's fortune could count, the plain trust of the powerful, and she had it in abundance from a young age, and she never once in her life spent it cheaply. What all of it gave Pamela was the exact education that would make her indispensable for the rest of her life. She learned, at home, in her own family, that the people at the center of great lives carry secrets that would burn the world down if they were handled carelessly, and that the whole value of a trusted intimate lies precisely in the refusal ever to handle them carelessly. She learned that a person can tell the truth and still keep faith, can acknowledge a great love and still guard its dignity, can say the important thing and withhold the cheap thing in the same breath. She had watched her own mother love a prime minister, and she had chosen, ever after, the exact words that honoured it without cheapening it. It was a rehearsal, though she could not have known it then, for the far longer performance that lay ahead of her, the 70-year watch over a cousin whose own private truth the world would one day demand and distort and comprehensively misread. The daughter who had learned to guard Edwina would in time become the woman who guarded Philip. She had learned, young, what was worth protecting, and she had learned exactly what such protection was worth. Chapter 6. Cousin Philip at the Altar. In November 1947, she watched her cousin marry the heir to the throne and watched him begin to disappear into the role. She was there in the abbey, one of the young women chosen to attend the bride, close enough to see every face and read every silence. And the wedding of Princess Elizabeth to Prince Philip was the most dazzling thing Britain had staged since before the war. A grey, rationed, half-bombed-out country, still counting its dead and queuing for its bread, poured all of its starved longing for beauty and hope into a single golden morning. Pamela stood among the bridesmaids and watched the cousin she had known as the boy from nowhere walk up to the altar to marry the very future of England. And with the eyes she had trained since childhood, she could already see the exact shape of the bargain closing quietly around him. Look hard at what the young man at that altar had brought to it, and at what he was being asked to give up in exchange, because the whole of his later character grows straight out of this trade. To marry into the British royal family, the stateless Prince of Greece had already begun to shed the little that he possessed. In the months before the engagement was even announced, he had formally renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles and styles. He had become a naturalized British subject. He had taken his uncle's English family name and become, plainly and simply, Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, folding himself into Pamela's own clan in order to make himself acceptable to the palace and the nation. He had a genuinely fine war behind him, a distinguished record in the Royal Navy, mentioned in dispatches, the one arena in his whole life where he had built something entirely his own by his own effort and courage. That naval record was no mere ornament, and it matters greatly to the true size of what he was about to give up. Philip had gone to war as a young officer and had been good at it, genuinely good, serving in the Mediterranean and beyond, and being mentioned in dispatches for his part in a great night action off the coast of Greece, the very country that had once cast his whole family out, where he had helped his ship to find and strike its targets in the dark. He had earned his rank the hard way, by plain competence under fire, in the one institution on earth that had ever given a stateless and abandoned boy a fair chance to prove exactly what he was worth. The Navy had been the making of him. It had taken the prince with no country and turned him into a capable man with a real profession and a real future ahead of him, quite possibly a future at the very top of the service, for he had the ability for it and the fierce ambition too. And it was this, precisely and painfully this, his one hard-won kingdom of his very own, that the marriage would now slowly and permanently take away from him. When people spoke lightly, in the years to come, of the lucky young prince who had married himself a queen, they very rarely stopped to reckon up what that luck had actually cost him. Pamela always did, and all of it, the name, the titles, the hard-won independence, the career, was about to be quietly and permanently subordinated to the woman standing beside him. The country saw a fairy tale. Pamela, who knew the groom to his bones, saw a far more complicated thing. She saw a proud, driven, self-made man of 26, walking with open eyes into a gilded cage that he had chosen for himself, and would then spend the whole rest of his life learning how to live inside. For the bargain of a royal consort is a strange and a lonely one. He would have every privilege and no purpose that was truly his own. He would be titled and housed and honoured beyond most men's dreams, and he would have no job, no rank of his own in any working sense, no constitutional role whatsoever, nothing at all to do but to support and to accompany, and to stand a single deliberate pace behind. A man who had commanded a fighting ship in a world war would find himself in the peace, with no ship to command and no clear duty on this earth, but attendance upon his wife. For a few precious years, though, before the cage fully closed, he was allowed something close to the ordinary life he had earned, and it is worth dwelling on because it was the last of it. Philip's naval career carried on after the wedding, and in the years around 1949 to 1951, he was posted to the Mediterranean island of Malta, serving as a serving officer, first as a lieutenant, and then in command of his own small ship. And there, for a golden interval, Princess Elizabeth was able to join him and to live, as nearly as she ever would, the life of an ordinary naval officer's wife in the sunshine, among the other service families, briefly and gloriously normal. It was the freest either of them would ever be, and both of them knew it afterward for exactly what it had been, a short reprieve before the whole weight of a throne came down. Pamela understood the value of those Malta years to the couple, because she understood better than most what was waiting to replace them. The sharpest wound of the whole arrangement did not fully reveal itself for years, and it cut at the single thing a proud man guards most fiercely, which is his name. When his children were born, they would not carry his surname. They would be royal. They would be their mother's. And the man who had given up his own titles to marry her discovered that he could not even pass on the adopted family name he had taken. He raged about it, in private, in words that have survived and that say everything. "I am nothing but a bloody amoeba," he is recorded as saying, the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children. It would take until 1960, 13 full years into the marriage, before even a partial compromise was reached and a joining of the two names was permitted to some of his descendants. Pamela understood, far better than the cheering crowds outside the Abbey ever could, exactly what that particular deprivation would mean to a man who had already lost his country, his home, and his parents, and who had painstakingly rebuilt himself around the single stubborn fact of who he was and what he was called. And yet, and this is the part the cruel caricature would always miss, he had also gained something enormous in the same bargain, and Pamela saw that side of it just as clearly. The boy who had been carried out of Greece in a fruit box, the child passed between borrowed houses, the schoolboy with no one to write to in the holidays, had just married into the most secure and ancient family in Europe. He had a country at last, and the grandest one going. He had homes, palaces, places that could never again be taken away from him at a revolutionary court's word. He had, above all else, a wife who loved him steadily, and a family that was, for the first time in the whole of his life, genuinely his own and genuinely permanent. The bargain took his freedom, and it gave him belonging, and for a man who had never once in his life belonged anywhere at all, that was a trade he made gladly and defended fiercely to the very end of his days. Pamela watched the two sides of it settle down onto him across those early married years, the privilege and the powerlessness, the belonging and the cage. She saw that the marriage was a true one, that whatever the world would later choose to whisper, the bond between her cousin and the young Elizabeth was real and deep and lasting. And she saw the strain gathering quietly underneath it, the frustration of a capable man with far too little to do, the temper that came of pride with no outlet, the brusqueness that was only ever the public face of a private discipline that had decided never, ever to complain. The fairy tale had a cost, and the cost was written into the fine print of the vows, and Pamela read the fine print because she alone among the wedding guests had known the groom since he was a boy with nothing in the world but his blood. She could not yet have guessed how soon and how completely the whole arrangement would be put to the test. Chapter 7. The Lady in Waiting. Friendship with a future queen is a delicate thing, and Pamela had been trusted with it since they were girls. That trust is the quiet engine of this entire story, the reason a Mountbatten daughter kept finding herself in the smallest and most private rooms of the monarchy. And it is worth understanding exactly what it was, because the title she carried, Lady in Waiting, sounds like mere decoration, and was in fact something much closer to a load-bearing wall of a royal life. Pamela and Elizabeth had known each other since early childhood, third cousins separated by only about 3 years, moving together inside the same tight, watched circle of palaces and estates and family gatherings. Pamela was close too, to the younger sister, Princess Margaret, the Quicksilver one, the one who felt everything loudly and hid nothing. They had been girls together in a world so small and so scrutinized that a genuine friendship inside it was a rare and precious thing. And the friendship between Pamela and Elizabeth was the real article, the kind that begins before either party has anything at all to gain from it, and therefore lasts when everything else in the world changes. It would endure for more than 80 years, all the way to the very end of both their lives, kept alive across every barrier that a crown could raise between two people by nothing grander than Christmas presents faithfully exchanged and letters faithfully answered year upon year upon year. Their friendship had already survived the war that scattered so much else. While Pamela spent those years first among the Vanderbilts in New York and then at her cold school in Dorset, Elizabeth remained in England through the same long conflict. And when the peace came, the two of them simply picked the thread back up as though it had never once been dropped. That was the whole nature of it, a bond sturdy enough to go underground for years and to come back afterward entirely whole. And it was exactly the kind of friendship that the crown, when at last it descended upon Elizabeth, could not possibly afford to lose. She would be allowed to keep very few things from her old, ordinary life once the reign began. Pamela was one of them, and both of them knew it. When Elizabeth married and her own household began to form around her, Pamela was drawn into it as a lady in waiting, and the role deserves to be genuinely understood rather than simply assumed. A lady in waiting is not a servant, and she is not, in any ordinary sense, an employee. She is a companion of equal birth who attends a royal woman through the ordinary and extraordinary hours of her days, and the whole position works only on a foundation of absolute discretion and absolute trust. She is present for the private moments and the public ones alike. She manages the small human machinery that a royal person cannot manage in the constant glare of attention, the letters and the gifts and the flowers, the smoothing over of an awkwardness, the quiet handling of the 100 tiny things that would otherwise reach the principal and wear her down. She sees the tiredness behind the wave, the flash of temper before it is mastered, the grief before it has been composed into something the cameras may see. And she says nothing, ever, to anyone, about any of it, for the whole of her life. For a woman like Pamela, it was the natural culmination of everything her life had trained her to be. She had grown up watching and holding her tongue. She had guarded her own mother's great secret with a surgeon's care. She had stood inside the ending of an empire and repeated not one word of what she had seen there. She was, in precisely the sense the role required, safe. A person into whose keeping the most exposed and most watched woman in the entire world could place her private self without a moment's fear. It was no accident whatever that she was chosen for it. The monarchy did not hand its innermost access out to the merely well-connected or the merely charming. It handed it only to the demonstrably, provenly trustworthy. And Pamela had already spent 2 full decades demonstrating exactly that quality in India and in her own family and everywhere else she had ever stood. The bond had been tested and proved long before the crown ever came near it, which is precisely why it held so firmly afterward. As girls, the two of them had shared the ordinary secrets of ordinary girls. And then, as the whole world slowly narrowed around Elizabeth and turned her into a living symbol, Pamela remained one of the steadily diminishing number of people who could still speak to her simply as a friend rather than as a subject. That was a far rarer and more valuable thing than any office, and Elizabeth knew it perfectly well and kept it close for the better part of 80 years. When the coronation came, in the summer of 1953, the great ceremony that fixed the young queen forever at the very centre of the nation's life, Pamela was among those who received the coronation medal struck to mark it, one more quiet token of a service that was really, at bottom, only friendship given a formal shape. But the medal and the title were never once the point of her, and both women would have said as much. The point was the thing that lay underneath them, the total, unremarkable, unbreakable reliability of a woman who had known the Queen since before she was a queen, and would go on treating her in private as the girl she had always been. In a life lived under the most relentless observation that the modern world could arrange, Elizabeth had almost no one left who wanted nothing at all from her. Pamela wanted nothing. She had her own name, her own fortune, and her own family soon coming. What she offered instead was the single thing that can never be bought or commanded, and the monarchy, which understood that difference perfectly, had drawn her in close and kept her there. And so, when a great tour was planned, a long journey out through Kenya and on to Australia and New Zealand, standing in for a king grown too ill to make the trip himself, it was entirely natural that Pamela should go. She would travel as one of the small inner party around the young couple, the friend and the cousin who could be relied upon without question, the lady-in-waiting who knew both of them, the bride and the groom, as very few others alive did. She knew Elizabeth as a friend of a lifetime. She knew Philip as a cousin of a lifetime. There was, in all the world, hardly another single person who stood in that exact double relation to them both, intimate with each of them, trusted by each of them, and invisible in just the way that let the two of them forget she was even there and watching at all. It placed her at the very heart of a marriage and a monarchy, at the precise moment that both were about to be transformed forever. She did not know that, of course. Not one of them did. The plan was simply a long and glamorous journey, a tour, a duty to be performed on behalf of a father who would surely recover, or would at the very least endure a while longer. The young couple left England in the last days of January 1952. On the 31st of that month, the king himself came to the airport to see his daughter off, standing there among the family and the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, to watch the aircraft carry her away toward Africa. The family waved from the tarmac and then went up onto a rooftop to watch the plane climb and vanish into the winter sky. It would be the last time on this earth that the king saw his daughter. He was a gravely ill man, watching his heir fly to the far side of the world, and something in the gathering must have known it, though no one said so. Pamela flew out with the couple into the African summer, into a world of sunlight and ceremony and great animals, carrying nothing heavier than a lady-in-waiting's ordinary duties, toward a treehouse in a high forest, and a morning that would ask her to become the first person on the whole earth to kneel before her dearest friend. Chapter 8. The Tree in the Forest. On the night the king died, his daughter was sitting in a treehouse in an African forest, watching elephants at a waterhole, and no one in the party knew. Of all the strange coincidences that history troubles itself to arrange, few are stranger or more perfectly cruel than this one. And Pamela was inside it, one of the small handful of people gathered in that remote and beautiful place, while, on the far side of the world, the whole meaning of their journey silently and completely reversed itself. To feel the full weight of what happened in the garden the following day, you first have to sit in the forest the night before, in the last hours of Elizabeth's life as a princess, when the worst news in the world was already true and had not yet arrived. They had come up into the highlands of Kenya, the young couple and their small circle, Pamela among them, in the first week of February 1952. The colony had given the pair a wedding present of a country retreat called Sagana Lodge, a simple, low house in the hills, and from there they made an expedition to a place that had already become half a legend, a lodge called Treetops, built quite literally into the branches of an enormous fig tree above a forest clearing, and a waterhole where the great animals of Africa came down to drink. To reach it, you climbed a ladder up into the canopy. To stay in it was to spend a whole night suspended in the African dark, listening to the forest breathe, watching by moonlight and by the first grey light of dawn as elephants and rhinoceros and buffalo moved and shifted below you. It was the kind of place a person remembers for a lifetime even when nothing else at all happens there. Something else was about to happen there. The reason the young couple were up in that tree at all was itself a quiet tragedy, and it deepens everything that came after. The tour was not truly theirs. It belonged by every right to the king, and it had been handed on to his daughter and her husband only because George VI had grown too ill to make the long journey himself. He was a man visibly failing. He had endured a serious operation only months before, the strain of the long war years catching up with him all at once, and those closest to him could see plainly that he was fading, even as the public was told comfortable and reassuring things. So the daughter went out in the father's place, to Africa and on toward Australia, standing in for a dying man who had come to the airport to wave her off with the whole family gathered around him. Everyone in the travelling party understood, in the vague way that people understand such things without ever quite saying them, that the king was not at all well. What not one of them understood, sitting up in the branches of the fig tree that night, was that he had already gone, that the stand-in had already, silently, become the sovereign, and that the whole careful architecture of the tour had been rendered meaningless hours before by a heart that had stopped in the cold Norfolk dark. Picture the party as it truly was that night, because the smallness of it is the whole point. This was no vast royal retinue with 100 officials. The inner group was tiny, a mere handful of people, the princess and the duke, a private secretary, an equerry, and the young lady in waiting who was also a cousin and a friend. Around them, on every side, the ordinary sounds of an African forest at night, the crash and shuffle of enormous animals moving in the dark, the sudden calls of birds, the vast and total indifference of a whole continent. Elizabeth, 25 years old, sat up through part of that night with her camera, delighting in the spectacle below her, entirely herself, entirely private. A young woman on a wonderful adventure with her husband before the long duties of the tour resumed in the morning. She was, in those hours, the very last thing she would ever be allowed to be again. A daughter with a living father and a future that was still, at least in theory, her own to shape. And while she watched the animals, her father was dying. Far away at Sandringham, the great house set in the flat, cold country of Norfolk, King George VI had gone to bed after a day out shooting, an ill man worn down by surgery and strain and the long, grinding weight of a crown he had never wanted, and had taken up only because his elder brother, Edward VIII, had thrown it away for the sake of a marriage. In the small hours of the 6th of February, quietly, in his sleep, the king's heart stopped. He was 56 years old. He died alone in the night, and for some hours not even his own household knew, so that the King of England lay dead in his bed, while his daughter, who had become queen in the very same instant, sat in a tree in Kenya, photographing elephants at dawn, knowing nothing of any of it. Hold the shape of that morning in the mind, because it is one of the purest pieces of dramatic irony the whole of the 20th century ever produced. In England, a dead king, and a household beginning slowly and with dawning horror to grasp it. In Kenya, a new queen who did not know that she was a queen, and around her a small party who did not know that they were suddenly attending a sovereign. The single most important fact in the entire British world existed, was already wholly true, was carved forever into history, and simply could not cross the distance to reach the one person it most concerned. The hunter guides at treetops would love to say, ever afterward, that a princess had climbed up into the tree and a queen had climbed back down it, and it was exactly, literally true, though not one of the people who came down that morning had the faintest idea that it had happened. It was Pamela herself, in later years, who gave that line its most memorable form. She went up that ladder a princess, Pamela said, and came down a queen. Pamela was there through all of it, present for the last of the ordinary hours, and she carried the sheer strangeness of it for the rest of her long life. She had watched empires end, and great secrets sleep. But she had never seen anything remotely like this. A beloved friend, transformed utterly by an event that none of the people around her could yet even perceive. A marriage and a monarchy, turning on an axis that lay buried on the far side of the earth. The party came down from the tree and returned to Sagana Lodge in the ordinary way, tired and happy and full of what they had seen, to rest through the heat of the day. Somewhere out beyond them, a message was already trying to reach them, a message that would have to travel by wire and by pure chance across half the turning planet, and that would arrive, when at last it did arrive, in a form that no one had prepared for and no protocol had ever imagined. The king was dead in England. In a lodge in the Kenyan hills, the new queen lay down to rest, and the terrible, tender task of telling her drew closer with every passing hour. It would fall, in the end, to the one man there who had known her longest, and to a young woman standing only a few feet away, who would have to decide, in a single, unrehearsed instant, whether her dearest friend was still her friend, or had become, in the night, her queen. Chapter 9. The news that could not be decoded. The most important message in the empire reached the forest and could not be read, because no one had brought the right key. It is a detail that sounds invented, a failure so small and so human, set against an event so enormous. And yet it is exactly what happened. And it stretched the most extraordinary morning of the century into hours of quiet, grinding, agonizing delay. The King of England was dead. His daughter was a queen. And the entire machinery built across 100 years of empire to carry such a fact swiftly around the world, jammed, at the last step, on a missing cipher key in the hills of Kenya. The news had left England quickly enough. By the middle of the morning of the 6th of February, the royal household at home had grasped the terrible truth that the king was gone, and the wires began to hum with the coded signals that were supposed to reach the travelling party first, ahead of the world's newspapers and radio stations, so that the new queen would learn of it in the right way and from the right hands. Secret telegrams were dispatched, encrypted in the careful manner that such things always were, addressed to the private office travelling with the princess. They arrived in Kenya, and there they simply stopped, because the cipher key that would have unlocked them, the one thing needed to turn the coded characters back into English words, had been left behind, packed away with other things, unavailable in the 1 hour it was most desperately required. The message sat in plain sight and could not be turned into meaning. The single most powerful piece of information in the British world had crossed the whole planet only to fall mute at the final step. So the truth reached the party the way that rumour reaches anyone at all, sideways, by accident, through the ordinary and unstoppable human network that no cipher on earth can control. The princess's private secretary, a careful and devoted man named Martin Charteris, was not at the lodge in that hour, but a short distance away, at a hotel called the Outspan, seeing to the endless arrangements of the tour. And it was there, in the most mundane setting imaginable, over the everyday business of a hotel, that he learned what the encrypted telegrams could not tell him. A journalist had picked the news up off the international wires, the flash that the King of England had died, and the word reached Charteris through that ordinary channel, a reporter's casual bulletin arriving before his own government's most secret cables could be read. It was an almost unbelievable way for the trusted servant of a new queen to learn of her accession, off the ordinary wire of a passing newspaperman in a hotel, rather than from the secret cables that had been built and sent precisely to carry it to her first. There is a bitter little irony folded inside that failure, and it says something true about the age that was quietly ending. The whole vast apparatus of empire and secrecy and coded signal, built up across a century precisely so that the crown should always know its own business first, had been defeated in the end by an ordinary reporter with an ordinary wire. The world's press already knew. The radio stations of a dozen countries were already carrying it openly. Only the new queen herself, resting quietly in her lodge, and the small circle of people sworn to protect her, were held for a few more hours inside the very last quiet of her old life. It was, in its own strange way, the final service that anyone on earth could still do for the girl that Elizabeth had been, to give her one more untroubled afternoon before the fact came for her. And the people around her performed that service instinctively, without needing to be told, because they loved her, and because there was quite simply nothing else left to give. What followed was a small, careful, painful relay, conducted by a handful of decent men, each trying to do a terrible thing as correctly as it could possibly be done. Charteris got word as quickly as he could to the equerry travelling closest to the couple, Commander Mike Parker, the Duke's own man and his friend. Parker needed to be completely certain before a single word was spoken, because a false alarm of this one magnitude was simply unthinkable, and so he confirmed it as best he could through the radio, listening for the broadcasts that were now beginning to carry the news openly to the whole of the world. And when at last he was sure of it, he did not go to the princess. He went to her husband. It was Philip who would have to be told first, and it was Philip who would then have to carry it the last short and impossible distance, from one room to another, from the world's knowledge into his own wife's heart. And around all of this, there ran a quiet, protective conspiracy of pure kindness that says something true about the age and about the people caught up in it. At the lodge, as the staff and the party began one by one to understand what had happened, someone made certain that Elizabeth would not stumble upon it by chance. The wireless set was quietly hidden away or silenced, so that the new queen would not hear of her own father's death from a stranger's voice on the radio, announced to the entire planet before it had been spoken to her gently by someone who loved her. It is a small act and a devastating one. For a stretch of hours on that hot afternoon, an entire travelling household knew that the young woman resting quietly nearby had lost her father and gained a crown, and every single one of them carried that knowledge with the greatest care around her, keeping it from her face and her ears so that when it came to her at last, it would come gently from the right hands and in the right way. Pamela was inside that circle of the knowing, one of the small party now holding the unbearable fact and shielding her sleeping friend from it. She had spent the whole of her life learning to hold what she saw and to say nothing, and never once had the training been asked to do so much in so short a span of time. She knew. Elizabeth did not. And the distance between those two facts, a few rooms, a few hours, a single sentence still unsaid, was the very last of Elizabeth's life as an ordinary daughter, being counted quietly down by the people who loved her most, while they arranged among themselves who would end it, and how, and where. There was no protocol for this exact moment anywhere in the vast rule book of the monarchy, no procedure written down for telling a young woman on holiday that her father is dead and that she is now queen of a quarter of the earth. There was only Philip, steadying himself in a back room to do it, and a garden waiting outside where it could be done away from every other eye. The task had found its man. All that now remained was for him to walk into the room where his wife was resting, and to take her outside into the afternoon, and to say the words. Chapter 10. The Garden at Sagana. They said he looked as though the whole world had been dropped upon his shoulders. That is the image the witnesses kept, the one that survived every retelling across the decades. The Duke of Edinburgh receiving the final confirmation and seeming, in a single instant, to buckle visibly under an invisible weight. He was a man already famous for showing nothing, for the armor he had forged in a childhood that taught him never to let his face betray him to anyone, and even he could not carry this without it showing. He understood at once what it meant, all of it, in one breath. His wife's father was dead. His wife was queen, and the modest, half-ordinary life that they had somehow managed to build, the naval postings and the quiet Malta years and the freedom to be a young couple on an adventure in Africa, was over, finished, gone in the time it took to hear a single sentence. He would have to tell her, and he would have to do it now. What he did next is the beating heart of this whole story, and the reason the title of this film points squarely at him. He did not send for the officials. He did not let the cold machinery of state deliver the blow to her through a secretary. He went to her himself. He took Elizabeth up from her rest, and he led her out of the lodge and into the garden, into the open air of the Kenyan afternoon, away from every other living person. And there, walking slowly with her up and down the length of the lawn, alone, he told her. No one heard the words. No account anywhere records them, and it is right that none does, because they were the most private words that would ever pass between them. A husband telling his wife that her father was gone, and that the whole rest of her life had just, in an afternoon, been decided for her. They walked, and he talked low to her, and the entire future of the British monarchy turned on a patch of grass in a garden in Africa, witnessed by no one, held between two people who had married for love and were now bound together by something far heavier and far more permanent than love had ever been. Picture the geography of that moment, because Pamela was standing inside it. The garden, the two slow figures moving up and down the lawn, the husband and the wife set apart from everyone, and nearby, held back, giving the couple the distance that the moment so plainly demanded, the small party who already knew, and among them the young lady in waiting who had known the bride since girlhood and the groom since the nursery at Broadlands. Pamela watched her two oldest connections in the whole world, the cousin and the friend, walk together out of the end of one life and into the beginning of another. And she waited, as every one of them waited, for the terrible walk to end and the new reality to begin in earnest. And when it did end, when Elizabeth at last turned back toward the house as queen, Pamela did a thing that she remembered vividly for the rest of her life, a thing that captures, in one single gesture, the whole meaning of everything that had just happened on that lawn. She went straight to her friend. Her very first instinct, the instinct of decades of shared girlhood and trust, was warmth, and she put her arms around Elizabeth and gave her a hug, the plain human comfort that one gives to a friend whose father has just died. And then, in almost the same motion, she caught herself, because the woman she was holding in her arms was no longer only her friend. She stepped back, and she sank down into a deep curtsy. In that one small choreography, the hug and then the curtsy, the embrace and then the reverence, in that single sequence of two heartbeats, Pamela Mountbatten became one of the very first people on the face of the earth to kneel before Elizabeth II as her sovereign. The friendship and the crown, resolved in the space of a breath, love coming first and duty following a hair behind it. It is the image this whole film is built upon, and it belongs entirely to her. Of the new queen herself in those first raw hours, Pamela's verdict was plain and full of admiration. Elizabeth, she said, showed great control. There were no scenes, no collapse, no visible unravelling of any kind. The young woman who had climbed up into a tree, a princess, and come down from it, a queen, absorbed the single largest blow and the single heaviest burden of her whole life, and held herself, in front of them all, with a composure that genuinely astonished the people around her. When the officials began, gently and unavoidably, the business that could not wait even a day, one of them asked her the question that the machinery of state most needed answered, the name by which she wished to be known and to reign. Her reply has echoed down the years for its sheer steadiness. "My own name, of course," she said. "Elizabeth." The private secretary Charteris, watching her steadiness in those first raw hours of a reign that had landed on her without any warning at all, remembered her ever after as very composed and as the absolute master of her fate. A girl of 25, told an hour or two before that her father was dead, had become in front of his eyes a sovereign in full and quiet command of herself. For Philip, though, that same garden had held an entirely different revelation, and Pamela understood it as very few others alive possibly could. His wife had gained a throne. He had lost a life. In the very instant that she became queen, the terms of his own existence were fixed forever and beyond appeal. There would be no going back now to the navy, no return to the command he had earned by his own effort, no more years of being, even part of the time, his own man in the world. From that single afternoon on the lawn, he would walk 2 careful steps behind her for the whole of the rest of his days, in public and in the deepest private sense, the consort to a reigning queen. He had carried the news that ended his own freedom, and he had carried it to the one person he most loved, and he had done it gently and correctly and entirely alone, and then he had stepped back, without a word of complaint, into a permanent second place and stayed there for the next 70 years. Pamela had watched him do the whole of it. She had seen the weight come down onto his shoulders and had seen him choose, in the same moment, to bear it and to say nothing. It was the first and the clearest sight she ever had of what he really was, and she never once forgot it. By the following evening, the new queen was flying home, and the images of that return became a piece of history in their own right. The small black figure descending the aircraft steps into a grey English dusk, already dressed in the mourning she had changed into before the plane landed, met upon the tarmac by the grave old men of her government, all of them bowing low to a girl. Pamela flew back with them, out of the African sunlight and into the cold, out of the private garden and into the great machine of a monarchy that would now close around her friend and her cousin, and never again fully open. She had gone out to Africa, attending a princess on a holiday. She came home, attending a queen. And she had learned, in a garden in the hills, the truth that she would then guard for the rest of her life, that the man the world would spend the coming decades misreading had met the very worst hour of his marriage by carrying it himself, quietly, and asking absolutely no one for any sympathy at all. Chapter 11. The Weight of the Crown. A year later, she followed the young couple around the world and watched a marriage learn to live inside an institution. The mourning had passed, the coronation had come and gone in its long blaze of gold and television, and the new reign needed now to show itself to the vast, scattered family of nations that still called Elizabeth their queen. So in the closing weeks of 1953, the Queen and the Duke set out together on a journey without any precedent in history, a tour that would carry them right around the globe, and Pamela went with them once again as a lady in waiting, back into the small travelling world where she could watch, up close and for months on end, exactly what the crown was doing to the 2 people she knew best in it. The sheer scale of that journey still has the power to astonish. It ran for close to 6 months, from the last weeks of 1953 deep into the middle of 1954. It carried the royal party across something like 13 countries and territories, a great looping chain of them, Jamaica first, and then out across the Pacific, Fiji and Tonga, then New Zealand and Australia for long, slow, exhausting national progresses, and then homeward at last by way of Ceylon and Aden and Malta and Gibraltar. It was the first time in the whole of history that a reigning monarch had circled the entire earth. Enormous crowds turned out at every single stop, millions upon millions of people in the total, many of whom would never in their lives lay eyes on the Queen again, and who treated the single distant glimpse as the event of a decade. It was the monarchy reinvented before the world's eyes as a global spectacle, and Pamela was inside the very machine that produced it, close enough to see the tired human beings behind the endlessly waving hands. There was a deeper thing happening on that tour than a long chain of parades, and Pamela was positioned to feel it, even if no one quite named it at the time. The monarchy she had grown up beside was reinventing itself in front of the whole world, and it was doing so out of sheer necessity. The empire that had once given the crown its meaning was dissolving, country by country, exactly as she had watched it dissolve in India. Something would have to replace it. And the answer, worked out on the move across these very years, was the thing that the tour was inventing as it went, a monarchy of presence and spectacle, and more of television, a crown that held its scattered family of nations together no longer by power, but by the simple sight of a young queen moving among them, gracious and dutiful and endlessly, tirelessly visible. The coronation itself, the summer before, had been the first great act of it, the first such ceremony carried live by the new cameras into ordinary front rooms, watched at a single stroke by more people than almost any event before it in the history of the world. The journey right around the earth was the second act, the crown carried now in person to the very ends of it. It worked because Elizabeth was exactly suited to it, and it worked because Philip, whatever it privately cost him, played his own part in it flawlessly, the handsome consort a step behind, waving and enduring and holding the whole picture together. Pamela watched a 1,000-year-old institution save its own life by turning itself into a spectacle. And she watched the two people she loved most pay the steep private price of being that spectacle's living centre. And the human cost of it, the private price of all that public glory, was exactly the thing that she was positioned to see. The couple had 2 small children, and they left them behind. For the better part of half a year, the mother who was now queen and the father who was now consort were absent altogether from their young son and their young daughter, held away by duty on the far side of the world, while the machine required the 2 of them to smile at strangers, day after day after day after day. The children were cared for, of course, and wanted for nothing material, and grew up in palaces surrounded by staff. But what they went without, for those long months and for many other stretches like them across the years to come, was their own parents. And Pamela, who had grown up as precisely that kind of child, the privileged one whose mother was always somewhere else in the world, understood the exact shape of that particular deprivation better than anyone else in the whole party. She had seen it once from the nursery, as the child. Now she was seeing it again from the other side. It was on this stage, the endless tour, the perpetual second place, the years of ornament without office, that the frustration of Philip's whole position became fully and permanently visible. Here was a man of real and restless ability, a decorated naval officer who had commanded a fighting ship in a war, reduced to a role whose entire content was attendance. He walked behind his wife into every room they entered. He had no ship now, no command, no department, no constitutional function of any kind whatsoever. The households and the courtiers who actually ran the monarchy were the Queen's, and not his, an entire apparatus of tradition and protocol and long habit built up around her, and never once around him. The record of those years carries the friction quite plainly, the sudden flashes of a hot temper, the impatience with fussy and pointless protocol, the visible bristling of a proud and energetic man against a life of ornamental uselessness. He had married the crown, and the crown had swallowed his purpose whole. And the gruffness that the wider public would come in time to know so well was already hardening, in these years, into the settled armour of a man with far too much drive in him and absolutely nowhere left to point it. Pamela saw the temper plainly enough, but she also saw exactly what sat beneath it, and she balanced the two of them the way that only a fair witness ever will. She saw a man who loved his wife steadily and completely, who had made a hard bargain with open eyes and fully meant to keep it to the letter, who channeled his blocked and dammed-up energy into the handful of things that the role did still leave genuinely open to him, the practical problems he could actually take hold of and solve, the few corners of the vast old institution where a driven and restless man might still make something real move. She saw the loyalty that never once wavered across 70 long years, the private tenderness that the public was simply never allowed to see, the fierce and protective devotion to the woman who now, by an accident of birth and death, outranked him in every single room they ever entered together. And she saw, in the small, unguarded moments, the sensitivity that the brusque exterior had been so carefully built to hide from the world. In the years that followed the tour, she watched the couple's own small son, the young Prince Charles, at a family luncheon, a sensitive and anxious boy, carefully trying to press the pulled stems back onto the strawberries on his plate, genuinely distressed to have spoiled them. And she remembered ever afterward how sensitive he was, this child growing up inside the very same crushing machine that had swallowed his father. It is the observation of a woman who always noticed the tender thing hidden inside the hard setting, which is the very observation she made over and over again about the whole of this family, and above all, about Philip himself. By the time the tour looped its way home in the summer of 1954, the transformation was complete, and it was permanent. The private couple of the Malta years was gone now for good, and it would never come back. In their place stood a queen, wholly given over to a life of duty, and a consort who had learned, mile by mile and crowd by crowd, how to live inside a role that gave him everything on earth except a purpose that was his own. And the marriage had not broken beneath the weight of it, which was itself a kind of quiet miracle, and Pamela knew perfectly well why it had not. It had been rebuilt, deliberately and daily, around the demands of the crown, with Elizabeth's iron sense of duty as its spine, and Philip's stubborn, wordless loyalty as its walls. What the world saw was a fairy tale monarchy touring the globe in triumph and being cheered by millions. What Pamela saw was two people that she loved, learning together, the hard way, to carry a burden that would never once in their lives be set back down, and one of them carrying it from a permanent second place that he had accepted entirely without ever pretending. To those who knew him, that it did not chafe him raw. Chapter 12. The Man She Defended. The world saw a rude old man who said terrible things at garden parties, and Pamela saw the boy who had lost everything and had never once said so. This is the chapter that the title of the film has been quietly promising all along, the reckoning with what she truly thought of him, and it has to be told the way that she herself actually told it. Because the popular picture of Prince Philip and the private picture, held by the tiny handful of people who knew him from the inside, were very nearly opposites of each other. And Pamela spent the last decades of her own long life quietly and stubbornly insisting on the second one. She had known him longer and watched him closer than nearly anyone else left alive, and her verdict, delivered patiently across her memoirs and her interviews, was in the end a defense, and not an accusation at all. The world's Philip, by the time he had reached old age, had hardened into a caricature as fixed and as flat as a cartoon. He was the gaffe machine, the the tactless Duke, the ready source of 100 cringing headlines, the man who said the wrong thing to the wrong person in the wrong country and appeared not to care in the slightest. The public laughed and winced and filed him neatly away under the single word, difficult. And Pamela, watching that caricature take hold and harden over the decades, knew it for the thin and lazy thing that it truly was, because she alone among the millions of onlookers could set it directly against the real boy she had grown up beside at Broadlands. She knew precisely where the hardness had come from. She had been there, more or less, at its very making. The rudeness that the country found so offensive was not arrogance. It was armour, forged in a childhood that had systematically stripped a small boy of a throne, a country, a home, a father, a mother, 4 sisters, and even in the end his own name, and had taught him in the process that the one truly unforgivable weakness in this world was ever to be seen to need. A man simply does not survive a beginning like that one soft. He survives it hard, and he stays hard for the rest of his life, and he lets the whole watching world believe him cold rather than ever once let it glimpse the size of the wound underneath. Set the 2 portraits directly side by side, the public one and the private one, and the sheer distance between them becomes the exact measure of how badly the world had misread him. The public saw only impatience. Pamela saw a first-class mind with no proper outlet anywhere, a formidable intelligence forced to fill its enormous, restless energy with garden openings and small talk, and the unveiling of plaques when it had plainly been built to command ships and solve problems. The public saw coldness. Pamela saw a man of deep and undemonstrative loyalty who had stood faithfully behind one single woman for 70 years, without ever once offering a public word of complaint, and without a single serious wobble in his devotion to her. The public saw a bully. Pamela saw the funniest man in the whole family, sharp and mischievous, and genuinely, warmly kind to the people he actually trusted, whose brusqueness with strangers was only ever the other face of an intense and self-protecting privacy. She did not pretend for a moment that he was an easy man. She knew that his temper was entirely real, and that his tongue could and did wound. But she insisted, right to the end of her life, that the difficult surface was the smallest and the least true part of him, and that beneath it there stood one of the most loyal and the least understood men that she had ever known in a long life spent among the powerful. There is a coda to Philip's story that Pamela witnessed from very close range, and it lays the whole truth of the man bare more gently than any argument ever could. In his mother's final years, the tragic Princess Alice, the deaf and gentle woman who had lost herself for a time to illness and had lost her only son for years to exile, came at the very last to live under that son's own roof. She spent the final 2 years of her life, from about 1967 until her death in 1969, living quietly inside Buckingham Palace itself, an old woman up in the high rooms in the dressing gown she wore by choice, while the vast machine of the monarchy roared on far below her. Pamela observed the household closely in those years, and what she recorded is quietly devastating in its plainness. The Queen, she said, was always marvellous with Princess Alice, endlessly patient and kind with a mother-in-law who could be, by every account, sharp and difficult, and feeling a real and personal responsibility for the old woman's care. And Alice herself lived up in the attic floors of the palace by her own deliberate choice, in her dressing gown, apart from everyone, while Prince Philip, she said, was very busy down below, carrying on the endless daily duties of his impossible role. A son who had been abandoned by circumstance as a small boy had, as a grown man, brought his broken mother home to die in a palace, and had then gone on quietly doing his job, while she rested peacefully upstairs. It is the whole of him gathered into a single arrangement of rooms, the difficulty and the duty and the buried, wordless, undeniable love. This is what Pamela meant when she spoke of what he really was, and it is worth being very precise about, because the phrase can so easily be turned into something cheap and knowing. She had no monster to expose. She had a man to rescue from a caricature. The thing that she had seen, over the whole span of 70 years, from the nursery at Broadlands to the garden in Kenya, to the quiet attic at the top of the palace, was that the gruff, impatient, occasionally quite impossible public figure was only ever the outer shell of someone the public had never once been permitted to meet. A displaced and abandoned boy who had taught himself to turn his losses into iron, and had then spent that hard-won iron, decade after decade after decade, in the patient service of his wife and her crown, asking nothing whatever in return. She had watched the world misjudge him for the better part of a whole century, and she had decided, with the quiet loyalty that was the deepest single note in her entire character, that the record of him would carry her version too, alongside all the gaffes. She was the keeper of the true Philip, and she kept him faithfully to the end, the man who stood always behind the man that everybody thought they already knew. And so, the deepest reversal of the whole long story finally comes clear. The very qualities that Britain found so hard to love in Prince Philip, the coldness, the brusqueness, the flat refusal ever to charm, were the exact same qualities that had allowed a boy with nothing in the world to survive at all, and then to stand, unbroken, through 70 years of a role that would have hollowed out and destroyed a weaker man entirely. The armour that so repelled the watching public was the very same armour that let him carry the crown's dead weight, year upon year, without ever letting it crush the life out of him. Pamela had understood all of this from the very beginning, from the days when a cousin with no home of his own kept arriving at hers, and she carried that understanding faithfully to the end of her own very long life. The world had been handed the gaffes, endlessly repeated. She had been given the whole man. She knew with certainty which of the two was the truth, and she spent her final decades making quietly certain that it was written down somewhere it could not be lost. Chapter 13. The second life she chose. At 30, she married a man who cared nothing at all for thrones and buried her mother a few weeks later. It is the great pivot of her life, the moment the eternal witness stepped, at long last, a little way out of the royal frame, and began to build something that was genuinely her own. And it began, as so much in this family always did, with a wedding of great glamour, shadowed almost at once by a death. In January 1960, at Romsey Abbey, the old church that stood near the family estate at Broadlands, Pamela Mountbatten married David Nightingale Hicks. Among the bridesmaids that day was a small girl of 9, Princess Anne, the Queen's own daughter, a quiet sign of just how close to the beating heart of the royal family this discreet Mountbatten daughter had always stood and would always stand. The man she chose was a genuine departure, and that was rather the whole point of him. David Hicks was an interior designer, a figure from a wholly different world, brilliant and modern and faintly outrageous, and already on his way to becoming one of the most talked-about decorators of his entire generation. He would make his name and his fortune with bold, geometric carpets and clashing, fearless colour and an eye that frightened the timid, dressing the houses of the rich and the fashionable, all through the 1960s and 70s. He belonged not to the palaces at all, but to the glossy design pages, and in marrying him, Pamela turned deliberately toward a life that was hers rather than the monarchy's, a life of taste and creativity and society instead of duty and endless attendance. She had spent the whole of her youth standing at the very edge of other people's enormous stories. Now, at last, at 30, she began to live a full one of her own. The world she stepped into on David Hicks's arm could hardly have stood further from the marble corridors and the morning black of her royal life, and that very contrast was its own kind of freedom. His was the world of the 1960s, as they were actually being lived by the fashionable, a world of bold rooms and famous clients and magazine photographers, of a style so distinctive that the plain name Hicks became a byword for a certain fearless modern taste. Where the monarchy prized continuity and restraint and the careful avoidance of anything new, her husband made his living precisely by breaking the old, settled rules of the drawing room, by setting colours side by side that no one had dared to try, by hanging pictures in tight grids and covering floors in patterns that seemed almost to vibrate underfoot. For a woman who had spent the whole of her life inside the most tradition-bound institution on the face of the earth, there must have been a real and private joy in it, in belonging at last to something that looked forward instead of forever back. She kept her royal friendships, of course. She remained the Queen's cousin and the Queen's friend, and the Queen stood godmother to her eldest child. But she had built herself a second country to live in as well, a country of colour and taste and family, and she moved between the two of them with the very same ease that she had once moved between the palace and the dispensary, at home in both and wholly owned by neither. The joy of it was cut almost immediately by a grief. Only a few short weeks after the wedding, her mother, the dazzling and impossible Edwina, died suddenly while on official duty far away in North Borneo, worn out at the last by the very humanitarian work she had thrown herself into so completely. She had driven herself across the world in the service of others for years on end, and she died, as she had largely lived, in motion and far from home, absent from her daughter's greatest day by a matter of weeks. Pamela, who had loved her difficult mother clearly and without any illusion, entered her marriage and her new life already draped in mourning, the two ancient poles of her family's whole existence, splendour and loss, meeting each other once again in the space of a single season. It was a pattern she knew by heart, the wedding and the funeral pressed close together, joy and grief served at the same table, and she absorbed it as she absorbed everything and carried on. From that shadowed beginning, there grew nearly 4 decades of a good and settled marriage, and a family that was, at last, entirely her own. The Hickses had 3 children across the 1960s. The eldest, a daughter, was born on Christmas Eve of 1961, and in a final mark of the family's enduring closeness to the crown, the Queen herself stood as her godmother. A son followed, who would grow up in time to carry his father's gift and become a designer in his own turn. And in 1967 came a second daughter, India, who would grow into a well-known figure in her own right, a model and a designer and a public personality, and who would, in the fullness of the years, become the very voice that spoke for her mother at the very end of it all. For much of these settled years, the family kept a London home in the discreet and exclusive chambers at Albany, just off Piccadilly, and they held it there for more than 30 years, a fixed and elegant address at the quiet centre of the city. The marriage lasted 38 years, until David Hicks died of lung cancer in the spring of 1998, at the age of 69. It had carried Pamela through the whole long middle of her life and had given her the one thing that her own childhood had so conspicuously lacked: a home that was steady and a family that was actually present in it. She had grown up as the watched-over, half-forgotten daughter of a mother who was always somewhere else in the world, and she had built, in her own house and her own marriage, something warmer and closer and far more constant than the grand, cold splendor that she had come from. It was the quiet triumph of her whole life, and it is desperately easy to overlook it beside the palaces and the accessions and the famous names, which is exactly the reason it should not be overlooked. The woman who had spent her youth guarding other people's private worlds had, in the end, made a rich and loving private world of her very own, and she had filled it with the children who would go on to carry her memory forward when every other person who remembered her world was gone. But she remained, always and to the last, a Mountbatten, and the great dark current of her family's history had not by any means finished with her yet. Even in the settled and happy years of her second life, the older and harder story ran on quietly alongside the new one, the story of empire and monarchy and the violent century that her family had ridden and helped to steer. And that older story was about to deliver, on a bright and ordinary morning at the very end of a summer, the single most terrible blow of her entire existence, the one loss against which all the other losses of her long life would forever afterward be measured. The man at the centre of everything, the father who had shaped her, the uncle who had saved Philip, the last Viceroy of India, was about to be murdered. Chapter 14. The Boat in the Harbour. On a bright August morning in 1979, the axis of her entire life was blown out of the water off the coast of Ireland. It is the wound that this family never fully healed, and it fell upon Pamela with a violence that reordered absolutely everything that came after it. Her father, Lord Mountbatten, now 79 years old, had for many years kept a holiday home in the far northwest of Ireland, a castle called Classybourne on the coast of County Sligo, where the family gathered every summer for the simple pleasures of the sea. It was a place of small boats and fishing and children and long light evenings, the least grand and the most beloved of all the settings of a very grand life. And it was there, into that gentle summer refuge, that the long and bitter conflict known as the Troubles reached out one morning and struck. On the morning of the 27th of August, a party from the family set out in a small wooden fishing boat, the Shadow the Fifth, for a morning out on the calm water just off the little harbour of Mullaghmore. The Irish Republican Army had hidden a bomb aboard that boat, and they detonated it in the calm water close by the little harbour, within clear sight of land, only moments after the party had set out. The explosion tore the boat apart. Lord Mountbatten was killed outright. So too was one of his young grandsons, a boy of just 14. So was a local Irish boy of 15 who had been helping with the boat that day and had no part in anything at all. And so, from the injuries she suffered, was the elderly mother of Pamela's brother-in-law, a woman in her 84th year. Pamela's sister Patricia and her brother-in-law John were pulled from the water gravely and terribly hurt, broken and burned and barely clinging to life. In a single instant, on a sunlit ordinary morning, the family lost 4 of its own and very nearly lost several more. Pamela's own account of that day is one of the most harrowing things that she ever set down, and it has to be handled with the very plainness that she gave it, because all of its power lies in that flatness, in the way that shock strips a person's language right down to the bone. She was at the castle that morning, not out in the boat. "I did not hear the explosion," she said. "My children heard it. The boat had not even properly left the harbour." Her sister Patricia was unconscious in the water. Her brother-in-law John was less badly hurt, though he had many broken bones, and he was at least still conscious. Another of the family, she said, was hurt. And then came the last, simplest, most terrible clause of the whole account, the one that ends it and ends the world that it describes. Nikki, the 14-year-old, and her father were dead. That was how she learned it, and that, decades later, was exactly how she told it, without a single word of adornment, because there is no adornment on earth that could survive contact with a fact of that size. The man who died in that water had been the fixed centre of Pamela's whole existence from the very first day of it. He was the father who had taken her to India and let her stand beside the ending of an empire. He was the uncle who had gathered up the abandoned boy Philip and given him a home and a future and a navy to belong to. He was the naval hero, the last viceroy, the great connector and arranger and survivor of the entire family, the fixed point around whom all the others had orbited for as long as Pamela had been alive to watch them. And he had been murdered on a family holiday, alongside a grandchild and a local boy who had done nothing at all to anyone, as a cold and deliberate act in a long and bitter war, the very violence that had smashed the thrones of Europe before Pamela was even born, the same brutal current of the century that had made her cousin Philip a refugee in a fruit box and emptied the great houses of England one by one, had now reached at last directly into her own family's summer and had taken its head. What a loss of that kind does to the people it leaves behind is never a single moment, but a long, slow unspooling, and Pamela lived the whole of it. There was the immediate horror of the day itself, the children who heard the blast, the sister pulled unconscious from the water, the frantic hours at the hospital while it was learned who had survived and who had not. There was the public grief of a whole nation, for Lord Mountbatten had been a great figure, a war hero and a statesman known to everyone, and his murder shook the country to its core. And then, beneath and behind all of it, there was the private grief that has no ceremony and no ending, the empty place at the head of the family that no one else could ever fill again. Pamela had lost her father, and her sister had lost a young son, and a whole generation of the family now had to learn to go on without the one man who had arranged and connected and steadied every one of them for as long as any of them could remember. So she did the thing that she had always done. She absorbed it, and she held the family together, and she carried on, because that was the only thing there was ever to do, and because she had learned very young that carrying on is precisely what the survivors owe to the ones who cannot. But something in her was marked by that morning off Mullaghmore that was never afterward quite unmarked again, and those who knew her best understood that the bright and sharp and seemingly unsinkable Pamela carried, underneath it all, a grief that she very rarely let a single soul see. There is a terrible symmetry in it, seen from the great height of the whole story. Pamela had been born into the wreckage of one age of royal violence, the fallen thrones, the murdered Tsarina in her cellar, the wandering princesses of nothing. And now, in her 50th year, a newer violence had closed the circle and killed her own father in almost the very same stroke of history. The world that her family had personified so completely, the world of empire and viceroys and the effortless assumption of the right to rule, did not simply fade quietly away in her lifetime. A part of it was blown to pieces in a small fishing boat off the Irish coast, and she was there for it, as she had been there for so much else, close enough to lose almost everything and to carry the exact and unbearable shape of the loss for the rest of her days. She had spent her whole life as a witness to other people's great turning points. This one was entirely hers, and it was by a long way the heaviest thing that she ever had to see. Chapter 15. The last one who remembered. One by one, the people who had stood in that Kenyan garden went on ahead of her, until she was the only one left alive who still remembered it. That is the strange and lonely privilege of a very long life lived close to great people. You become, in the end, the last living keeper of a room that no longer exists anywhere but in your own mind, the final door into a morning that every other person who was there has long since left behind. Pamela lived on into her 90s, And in her last years, she watched the two people at the very centre of her whole story, the cousin and the friend, go before her into the dark, and she found herself alone at the end, as the last true witness to a vanished world. Prince Philip died in the spring of the year 2021, at the very great age of 99, after more than 70 years standing at the Queen's side. For Pamela, the loss was of a person she had known for longer than almost anyone else on the earth had known him, the cousin from the nursery at Broadlands, the boy carried out of Greece in the fruit box, the man who had walked his wife across the grass in the garden. And the Queen understood exactly that, precisely and immediately. When Pamela wrote to her old friend after Philip's death, Elizabeth wrote back to her, and the single line that she chose is one of the most quietly moving things in the entire record of that friendship. "Of course," she wrote, "you have known him longer than I." In that one short sentence, the Queen of England acknowledged the very thing that this whole film has been about from its first minute, that Pamela's acquaintance with Philip ran back further than the marriage, further than the crown, further even than Elizabeth herself, all the way to the very beginning, to two royal children in the same scattered and stateless family. She had known him the longest of anyone, and now she would outlive him too. The following year, the friend went as well. Queen Elizabeth II died in the September of 2022, after the longest reign in the entire history of the nation, and with her passing, the last equal of Pamela's own youth was gone from the world. Pamela, by then in her 93rd year, attended the state funeral in the Abbey alongside her daughter India, one of the very last surviving human links to the girl who had become queen in a garden in Africa 70 years before. And there, in the great church, old and frail and near the end herself, she did once more the very thing that she had first done on a lawn in Kenya in 1952. She curtsied. A woman of 93 lowered herself in reverence to her friend one final time, the very same gesture with which she had greeted the new reign at its very beginning, closing a circle that had taken 70 years to draw all the way round. The hug and the curtsy of the young woman in the sunlit garden had become the deep and aching curtsy of the old woman at the grave, the first subject and, very nearly, the last mourner. The identical act of love and duty offered once at the start and once again at the very end. With Elizabeth and Philip both gone from the world, Pamela found herself holding a curious sort of title, the kind that history hands out to whoever simply manages to last the longest. She had become the oldest living descendant of Queen Victoria, the senior survivor of that vast and tangled royal family tree, the very final leaf on a branch that reached all the way back to the old queen who had presided over the whole imperial age. She was the last one who remembered the accession from the inside. She was the last who had known Philip as a boy. She was the last who could speak of Edwina and of India and of the Viceroy's house out of her own living memory rather than out of the pages of a book. She had outlived her entire generation of the story, and she stood there alone at the end of it, the sole keeper of a whole world that now existed nowhere at all, except in her recollection and on the pages that she had written. The new reign, when it came, made the passing of her world quietly and unmistakably plain. When King Charles was crowned in the spring of 2023, the guest list for the deliberately slimmed-down ceremony of a modern monarchy did not include the aged cousin who had curtsied to his mother in a Kenyan garden before he had even been born. It was noticed, and it was remarked upon, this absence of one of the very last living bridges to the reign that had only just ended. And Pamela met it, as she met everything else in her life, with grace and entirely without complaint. Her daughter observed that Pamela herself firmly believed in the thinning down of the royal family, the paring of it back to its essential few, and so she felt no grievance whatever at being among those gently set outside the frame of the picture. It was, in its own quiet way, the final and perfect expression of the character that this whole film has traced from the start. The woman who was always in the room and never in the picture, content, even at the very end of her long life, to stand aside and let the great story go on without her in it. There is a particular loneliness in being the last, and Pamela came to know it in these final years better than almost anyone ever has the chance to. She had outlived not only Elizabeth and Philip, but very nearly every other person who had shared the world of her youth, the aunts and the cousins and the courtiers, the whole crowded cast of the old family photographs. The rooms that she remembered were gone. The people who could have finished her sentences were gone. She had become, in her great age, a kind of living archive, sought out by the historians and the biographers precisely because she was the only one left anywhere who could still say, out of her own direct memory, how it had actually felt to be there in the garden, in the palace, in the Viceroy's house. So she sat for the long interviews. She let the cameras in, and she understood, with the clear-eyed practicality that had always been the bedrock of her, that this was now the whole of her remaining usefulness in the world, to be the last witness for as long as there was still a witness left to be, and to spend what remained of her memory carefully before it went out of the world for good along with her. What she left behind, in the place of grievance, was testimony. In her last decades, Pamela had done the one thing that a witness can ever really do against the slow, erasing power of time. She had written it all down. She had set down her memories of India and the transfer of power, of her mother and Nehru, of the accession and the tours, and the long, strange marriage at the very centre of the monarchy, in a series of memoirs published across her final years, the last of them appearing only shortly before her death. She had told her story out loud on camera as well, sitting for long and patient interviews, and she had allowed the biographers of the Queen and of Philip to draw freely on what she alone had actually seen with her own eyes. She had made herself, quite deliberately, into a record that would last. And so, as the people who had shared her vanished world went ahead of her one by one, the room that they had all once stood in together did not vanish entirely with them, because she had built it a home in words, and she had left the door of it unlocked for whoever should come after. Chapter 16. What the Witness Keeps. She died on a Friday in June at 97, the last of her kind, and she took the garden at Sagana with her. It was the 5th of June in the year 2026, and she went, by every account of it, peacefully, at the very great age of 97, having kept right to the very end the qualities that had defined her from the beginning. Her daughter India announced it in words that landed like the closing line of a book, saying that although there was no tragedy at all in the death of a woman of 97 who had lived so full and so long a life, the grief would still be entirely unavoidable, and that her mother had kept, right up to the last, the impeccable style, the sharp mind, and the effortless charm that had made her not merely a cherished figure, but in the truest possible sense, the last of her kind. The phrase was exact, and it was earned. With Pamela gone, something in the world was finished that could never now be replaced. For with her, there also died the very last first-hand memory of that morning in the Kenyan hills. Every other person who had stood in the garden at Sagana Lodge, who had known the truth before Elizabeth herself did, who had watched Philip walk his wife slowly across the grass and carry to her the news that ended one whole life and began another, had gone on ahead of her into silence. And now the last of them was gone as well. The garden, which had lived on so vividly in her memory for decade after decade, long after the treehouse and the lodge, and the whole vanished apparatus of that reign had crumbled away, went at last with her into the dark. There is no one now alive who saw it. There is only what she chose to write and what she chose to tell. The careful record that she made in the full knowledge that a witness who does not speak leaves behind her nothing at all but a locked and empty room. Think for a moment of everything that would have been lost had she chosen silence instead. The hug and the curtsy in the garden, known to history at all only because she chose to record it. The line about the princess who climbed up the ladder and the queen who climbed back down, given its lasting shape by her. The Private Philip, the loyal and wounded man standing behind the public gruffness, defended by the one single person who had both the standing and the knowledge to defend him properly. Her mother's great love, held to the end in its true and careful proportions, deeply felt and never once cheapened into gossip. None of it was inevitable. All of it might simply have vanished, as most of the private truth of most great lives does in the end vanish, unspoken and unrecorded, the moment the last person who held it dies. That it did not vanish is Pamela's own doing, and it is the quiet argument that her whole long life makes to us, that the watcher at the very edge of the frame turns out to be very nearly the most important person in the room, because she is the one who decides, in the end, what the future will be allowed to know. And this is the deeper truth that her long life had always been quietly circling, the thing that the whole of this story has been reaching toward from its first line, the intimate truth of monarchy, the real human texture of it, the grief that hides behind the composure and the wounded man who stands behind the caricature does not survive on its own. It survives only through the few trusted people who stand at the very edge of the picture and who choose, in the end, to speak. Pamela had spent the whole of her life being always in the room and never in the picture. And it turned out, in the end, that this was the single most important place that any person could ever stand, because the ones at the very center of the frame can never tell you what it was truly like to be them. Only the loyal watcher at the edge can do that, the confidant, the cousin, the lady-in-waiting who saw absolutely everything, and then repeated only what she carefully chose to. She had guarded her mother's great and secret love, and she had defended her cousin's badly misjudged heart, and when at last the time was right, she had opened her hand, slowly and with great care, and let the world have exactly the part of the truth that she judged it fit to hold. Her cousin Philip, in the very end, was the truest mirror of her, and she had understood that all along. He too had spent the whole of his life at the edge of the frame, a careful pace behind the crown, a consort to a power that he could never once hold in his own hands, watched by absolutely everyone and genuinely known by almost no one at all. The world had been handed his gaffes, and it had kept the man himself hidden. It had taken a witness at the very edge of his life, one who had known him since he was a small boy, carried out of a burning country in a fruit box, to set down at last who he had really been, the loyal, the difficult, the wounded, the unbreakable figure who stood forever behind the flat cartoon. She was that witness. She did precisely that work. And then she followed him quietly out of the world, the last person left alive who had watched the whole enormous arc of it, from the exiled and abandoned child, to the man alone with his wife in the garden, to the old prince who brought his own broken mother home at the last to die under his roof. So the image returns, here at the very close, to exactly where it began, to a garden set high in the Kenyan hills on a February morning long ago, and to a young woman of 22 who stepped toward her dearest friend in the world and, in a single unrehearsed motion, gave her a hug and then sank down into a deep curtsy. Love coming first, and duty following just a breath behind it. She was always in the room and never in the picture. That was her chosen place, and she filled it faithfully for 70 years, true to the people that she loved and to the truth that she carried for them, until she alone was left of them all. And then, at the last, not even her. What the witness keeps, she keeps only for a little while. And then the room falls quiet, and the garden empties out, and everything that she saw and would not sell passes at the last into the keeping of history, which is the only place, in the end, that any of it was ever truly safe. If this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe so that the next life told here reaches you the day it lands. And before you go, tell me one thing down in the comments. Do you believe the world was ever truly fair to Prince Philip? Or did it only ever see the gruffness and never once the man that Pamela knew? I would love to read what you think.